Thank you for joining today's webinar on the NCPERS 2018 Public Retirement System Study and Dashboard tutorial. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning, which provides remote, continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. In today's webinar, we will be reviewing the findings of the 2018 study, which was released in January. NCPERS, in partnership with Cobalt Community Research, has been conducting this annual survey since 2011. What is interesting and unique about our study is that it gathers data from the full vertical profile of public pensions at the state, county, and local plan levels. We will also have a live demonstration of the study dashboard. The dashboard is a dynamic, interactive platform that allows users to adjust survey parameters so that you can see the data that is of particular interest to you. Leading us in today's webinar is William St. Amour. William serves as Research Director at the Municipal Employees Retirement System of Michigan and as Executive Director of the Cobalt Community Research. We encourage audience participation. Please submit your questions by using the GoToMeetings portal. However, to ensure that we can cover all our topics, we will hold your questions till the last part of the program. With that, William, I'll turn over the webinar to you.
Thank you, Hank, and good morning, everyone. As we go through this, as Hank mentioned, save your questions to the end, and then we'll have a period of time that we can go through those in a more structured way. But just to introduce Cobalt and what it is that we do, we're a 501c3 not-for-profit research coalition. We've been collaborating with NCPERS for a number of years on this particular project. Our mission is to provide research and education, and we focus mainly on local units of government, retirement systems, and nonprofits. We are based in Charlotte, Michigan, and for those of you who live somewhere south, I hope you enjoy your warmth. We're looking forward to getting a little bit more heat here as well. Study goals. There are several things that we want to achieve with this particular study. We want to explore the practices that public sector retirement funds have in place currently and some of the things that they're looking at implementing here in the next couple of years. We also wanted to look at the most current data available on your current fiscal condition and steps you're taking to ensure fiscal and operational integrity. And certainly funds have been very, very careful to be doing these kind of things. And really, I've been impressed year after year to see the things that funds are putting in place. Last of all, we want to identify best practices and strategies for lowering the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And there's a number of ideas that people have submitted that has worked well for them. Methodology, very similar to, identical to past years. We collected the data by survey, September through December. We conducted an email as well with a mailed reminder at the end of it. There are two groups of respondents that we focused on. One group are the NCPERS members, and then we also sent out to the largest non-NCPERS funds based on the number of assets and participants that they had. So our response was very strong. We heard back from 167 funds. One of the things that we like to do within the studies is look at the folks who responded to the previous year and this year, because that really gives us a nice apples-to-apples view of some of the changes taking place. And there were 98 funds that participated in both years, which is fantastic. So looking at the folks who responded, it's a very similar pattern to the types of funds that responded in prior years. The only significant differences were at the county level and for educational organizations as well. So funds that have educational staff, we had an increase in participation by those types of funds by about 10%, and we had about a 6% drop in the number of funds that serve county funds. But again, those are pretty small changes, and overall, the pattern is very consistent with the pattern we've seen in prior studies. One of the things that we want to do is look at funding levels. And funding levels continue to rise despite more conservative actuarial assumptions. For funds reporting in both 2017 and 2018, so that cohort of folks that responded to both, the average funded level rose more than 3% to 72.2%. When we look at all of the respondents for 2017 and 2018, we also saw an increase as well, from 71.4% to 72.6%. So there's some nice things going on on the funding level. When we look at some of the subsets of that, for funds that are in Social Security, we've seen an increase that's pretty significant. The average funded level went to 75%, up from 71.4% last year. For those funds that are not eligible for Social Security and typically have higher benefit levels, the change was going from 63.5% in the 2017 study to 69.4%. So some very nice gains. Investment assumption is also something that we've been watching closely over the last several studies. And again, this year, as in prior years, we've seen that investment assumption continue to become more conservative. So it dropped from 7.49% to 7.34%. About 83% of the funds that responded this year say that they've reduced their assumption, or they plan on doing so in the next year or two. So really, there's been a lot of action, and that continues to go down. This particular chart is basically showing you a distribution of those assumed investment returns. So on the vertical axis, you can see the assumed rate of return, and then you can see across the horizontal the size of the fund based on the total number of actives and annuitants. So very much clustered right around that average. And you've got a few outliers that are a little bit higher, and you've got some folks that are very conservative with what those assumptions are. The one-year investment returns averaged 13.4% for the plans reporting in 2018, well above the 7.8% reported in 2017. The 5- and 10-year returns were also higher, and the 20-year returns averaged 7.2%. The 1-year, 5-year, and 20-year investment returns are near or above the investment assumptions. So that's, again, a very solid picture for this year. We'll see what next year looks like. The market value of fund assets continues to exceed the actuarial value of assets for the respondents this year as well. When actuarial value exceeds the market value, there's often a lot of criticism that comes up claiming that the actuarial smoothing is actually hiding poor investment performance. That's not the case for this year, but that's something that you'll want to keep on your radar for next year, depending on what your year-end returns look like. I mentioned that the assumptions are getting more conservative, and here's another example of that. Funds really are working on lowering their investment return assumptions. The amortization periods, those have shortened as well from 23.8 years to 22.4 years. And the percentage of plans that are using a closed or a fixed amortization period has increased. So only 62% of folks used the closed amortization last year, and that's now gone up to about 73%. Despite the more conservative assumptions, the contribution rates as a percentage of payroll have been pretty stable. Employer contribution rates declined from 21% to 20% of payroll for those funds that responded in both 2018 and 2017. And the employer contribution rates were flat for all of the funds that reported in both 18 and 17. One of the things that I think is going on under the surface of this is that the payroll is rising. People are getting paid a little bit more. So the actual dollars being contributed are going up, but it's staying basically very proportional based on the percentage of payroll that's being contributed to the funds. The trend of public funds remaining cost-effective continues. For funds reporting in both 2017 and 2018, the average expense, so the total of both the administrative and the investment, remained flat at 60 basis points. And again, the 100 basis points equal 1 percentage point. For all funds, the total expense is 60 basis points, which is a little bit above what it was last year. Last year it was at 55 basis points. To put it in some perspective, according to the 2018 Investment Company Fact Book, the average expenses of pure equity funds average about 59 basis points. And hybrid funds that are more comparable to public retirement funds average 70 basis points. So this basically means that public funds with lower expenses are providing a higher level of benefit to members for each dollar that's being invested, and also, has an additional economic impact for the communities that those members live in. And this graph is essentially showing you the basis points on the vertical, the size of the retirement fund across the horizontal. The blue line is the expenses for the hybrid plans in the private sector, and then you can see the average at 60 for what public funds are reporting. Another area that we've been watching are health plans and the kind of health plan availability that we've been seeing. In 2018, about 46% of the respondents are offering a health plan or a subsidy, and 64% are not. In 2017, only 40% offered a plan and 60% did not. So that's an increase of about 6% that are offering plans that didn't last year. There's also been an increase in the inclusion of active and retirees by 6% and 3% respectively. You can see the increase in actives here and the increase in retirees here in terms of who's eligible for the plan. The one area that we saw some interesting change was in beneficiaries. This actually dropped by 5% compared to last year. So it's interesting to see if that trend continues. Something else that we saw an interesting bump on is the healthcare subsidy or stipends, those kind of things. And that's starting to perk up a bit more compared to last year's. So that's a summary of really the high points of what's included in the report. The paper report that's available to you, and I believe it's attached as a handout for this presentation, goes into much more detail, and also it provides the open-ended responses that people had in terms of what some of the things are that they put in place, both from an investment perspective as well as from the perspective of reducing liabilities. So I encourage you to spend a bit more time with that report, go through it, and see some of the things there that are going on with your peers. What I'd like to do now is really open up the interactive portal so you can get a sense of how that looks and how to use it. So if you want to get in there and poke around, you know what you're doing. So the link is based on this presentation. I'm going to minimize this and hopefully not drop the video feed and go to that so you can see how this works. Okay, so this is housed in Tableau Public. Tableau is a really useful utility if you ever want to do some dynamic data presentations for your board or for staff. This is organized in a couple of different ways. First of all, you can see these tabs going across the top, looking at different elements of the study, from who responded to fund confidence to amortization assumptions on down the line. And you can scroll those tabs over here on the far right-hand side. So if you don't like navigating by the tabs, you can also come over here to this little down arrow, and if you click on that, it basically gives you a table of contents where you can jump immediately to each of those pages. So the first page is really just giving you a sense of the key findings, what I talked about in this presentation, but then you can go through the individual tabs and get some additional detail. So if we look at who responded, you can see the characteristics of folks. So these are the jurisdictions served. So you saw this chart in the PowerPoint. This is for 2018. So if you wanted to switch the study year and see what last year's study was, you can click on this and it'll automatically update these charts so that you can really look and see what those comparisons are. Other kinds of filters that are available is this one called prior year participation. So if you wanted to look at just that cohort of people that responded both last year and this year, you can do that by clicking yes. So basically unclicking no and all, and it'll just leave the yes option. So then when you're looking at 2017 and 2018, it's just for those funds that replied to both. So you can really pick up that very sensitive kind of change from one year to the next. If you want to change your filters, you can go through and manually change them all. Or if you go down to the bottom, there's a couple of options. One is this little arrow here, this undo, and if you click on that, it will undo the last filtering that you did. If you've been playing with it quite a bit and you're trying to figure out, how to undo the whole mess that I set up, this arrow with a line on it basically resets all of the filters, and then you're ready to go again. Let me talk about a couple of the other filters that you might want to play around with. One is the Social Security eligibility filter. So this is looking at people who are eligible for Social Security or not eligible for Social Security. So you can toggle just to get into those specific groups if you wanted to compare them, or if you're something like a police fund and you're all not eligible for Social Security, then you can look at that cohort more specifically. Getting even more precise, we added in this public safety filter. So if you wanted to see the funds that said, yes, we include public safety participants in our plan, you can click on that and just look for the folks who are indeed public safety employee plans. And that allows you to really kind of drill in and get more information. You can also play around with the size of the fund. So there's a slider here where you can just bring up the minimum or pull down the maximum, or you can just go into two larger buckets in terms of the plans that are greater than 10,000 participants or fewer than 10,000 participants. So there's lots of ways of playing around with it. Something else that you can do with these is if you go on a chart and you click on it, generally when you click on it, it gives you a menu that allows you to copy the chart itself. So if you wanted to pull some of this in for a PowerPoint presentation, that's available as well. There's also a lot more data in here than what I covered in the summary presentation. So we talk about overall Social Security eligibility, the inclusion of overtime in the benefit calculation. We had questions regarding if board members are allowed to call and participate via conference call. And we also talked about state-sponsored plans in the private sector. So have you discussed or had some conversations of potentially offering a state-sponsored plan that would be available to companies within the state that you do business or the county? So you can see what that looks like and how that's trended out over time. Some other areas that we have in here, let me go ahead and reset the filter so that things I played with stay consistent with the numbers that I showed you in the presentation. But we look at fund confidence. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are funds to address the various issues coming at them over the next 2 years? And you can see that that's above an 8, so that's continued to be pretty stable compared to last year's. But it is something that's a nice thing to keep an eye on. And again, you've got a range in terms of plans, but mostly folks are pretty optimistic in terms of how they're set for the next couple of years. We can dive into more detail on the expenses and filter that out in different ways. You saw this chart in the presentation. There's also a breakdown by investment basis points and administrative basis points if you wanted to see for the folks who reported those two areas. One thing I do like to mention, and this is called out in the longer paper report, is that if you add these two numbers together, it doesn't equal this number. And the reason why is because some people just reported administrative points only or investment points only. So sometimes the totals don't exactly equal what we have in the other chart. That's just looking at the average combined expenses. Amortization assumptions is the next tab, so we can look at those, and I shared that with you in the presentation. Economic assumptions. So we talked about the investment assumptions, but you can look to see what the inflation assumptions are in the investment smoothing period that people are looking at. Again, those are pretty consistent with last year, so I didn't pull them out as key findings. But if you needed to filter in and look at other types of groups, then you can certainly dive into that. There's a number of tabs looking at various types of trends. So if we look at retirement plan changes, lowering the actuarial assumed rate of return, that's one that I pulled out and mentioned specifically, but there's a number of other kinds of changes that people have put in place, raising the benefit age, service requirements, increasing employee contributions, hold or lengthen the amortization period to improve affordability, and on down the line. So you can see the folks who have put it in place or the folks who are considering putting that in place. We have information on COLAs in terms of what the typical COLAs are out there. We look at the trends in business practices. So are you looking at doing a building security audit? Are you looking at conducting an actuarial audit for third-party actuaries? So this gives you a sense of what some of those practices are that your peers are putting in place and what things people are looking at doing here in the next couple of years. Trends in engagement. This is getting into some of the issues like developing a public relations plan to address pension envy, developing talking points on key issues affecting the fund, and a number of those kind of things. Communication capabilities is the next tab. And here we're looking at your ability to do different kinds of outreach things, such as sending postcards or mass phone messages or text messages and that kind of thing. So you can see what that looks like and what people are looking at doing in the future. Trends and oversight practices. Do you have an investment policy? Have you adopted that? Written fiduciary standards, a number of those kind of just smart oversight things that people are putting in place, and you can get a better sense of what people are doing and what they're planning on doing. Investment returns. So you can look at the investment returns that I shared with you in the report, but you can also look at the returns by asset category. So global equity, for example, returned 14% last year for this particular group of folks who reported to this year's study. You can see that domestic equity particularly was strong at 18%, international equity at 18.9%. So you can play with the filters. We can also look at the asset allocation. So what is the mix that people have put in place? So you can see the current versus the target here. And again, you can play around with the filters. One of the additional filters that we added into this is the ability to look at the 1-year returns. So if you wanted to look at the folks who had the top returns, you can slide that up and get a sense of what their allocation looked like. We do pull that out in the full report, so that's something that you'd want to look at. And then there's also a 10-year return slider that you can look. So if you wanted to look at the longer term performance and see what that asset allocation looked like, you can dive in and do that as well. We do have this other category for the asset allocations, and if you click down here in this word cloud, it'll take you into the verbatims telling you exactly what those other kinds of asset classes are. And the words here are the words that came up most often in the kind of other assets that people talked about. One thing I do want to point out is that if you take all of these and add them up, they do not equal 100%, and that's because everybody didn't necessarily respond to all of the asset categories. They might not have had the information in front of them, so for them it didn't total to 100, or there were also some folks who might have checked both global equity and international equity. So we just wanted to report out for each of these what that allocation looks like. But if you do try to add it up to 100, while it usually adds to 100 at the individual level for the individual respondents, when we aggregate it like this, it doesn't equal out to 100 just because of some of those variations in the reporting pattern. Funded level. So you saw this chart. You can see the overall funded levels for the different groups that you can filter by. You can also look at overall sources of revenue. So how much of the revenue has come from investment returnings, employer contributions, and member contributions. So that's a nice thing to look at as well, depending on some of the outreach and education efforts you're putting in place. And then health plans, we talked about that already, so you've seen that. And then best practices, looking at strategies to reduce the unfunded actuarial liability. Again, it's word cloud. The words that came up most often are the largest, but if you click on it, it'll take you into the verbatim comments. And then the innovation and best practices, things that people have put in place that they think is kind of cool that other funds would like to know about. Again, you click on this and it'll pull it out. We did sum up the themes. So the words that came up most often, we identified the themes that were underneath those. So you can see that in both of these areas. But we also have all of this, including all of the verbatim, baked into that paper copy that you have attached to the presentation here. So I think that takes us to the end. To navigate, again, easiest way is just to go up here and click at the beginning, and it takes you right back up. So key takeaways, you can navigate across the top. You can navigate here in the corner. If you want to undo filters, you can undo your last filter down here, or you can undo all of your filters so it restores it to the default right there. Hank, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, William. So just a couple of quick questions. One is that in terms of expenses, the folks noticed that there were some respondents with zero expenses. Do you have an explanation for those that type of response?
I do, and that's often coming from the smaller plans that aren't necessarily taking some of those the administrative expenses and breaking them apart separately for the fund. So often it's a county fund or a municipal fund where they just don't, they've got a certain number of staff that do all of the accounting work, and they don't break out their time by, general city work and how much time they spend on the pension specifically. And so they just report zero, or they leave it blank.
Great. And then in terms of the interactive dashboard, there's a question about are there additional functionalities that are available, or if not, what's the process for suggesting additional functionality?
Yeah, I would certainly take any ideas that you have and pass them along to Hank, to NCPERS, because we'll be looking at adding some additional functionality for the 2019 report. One of the things, for example, that we're looking at doing, let me just jump over to one of the tabs randomly, is we have public safety identified as one of the sets of filters, and Hank and I talked about adding other types of filters, basically along the lines of for city villages, for police fire, for county, for educational, state, so that you can get that level of granularity and look at the cohort of just folks who have state employees in their system. But if you do have other ideas, let us know.
Yes, so let me just underscore that. So folks, if there are additional functionalities that you'd like to see, please send it to me at hank@ncpers.org. and I will forward it over to William. And as we plan for the 2019 survey sometime this summer, William and I will talk about the feasibility of adding the requested functionality and whether Tableau can accommodate that. Well, William, you must have done a great job because there are no other questions. So in conclusion, I will say thank you very much. And once this webinar concludes, there are 3 short survey questions that we ask all attendees to take. And our next webinar will be on February 26th on the new white paper that NCPERS will be issuing on pre-funding retiree healthcare with Gallagher Benefit Services. And in terms of the 2018 Public Retirement System Study, the subject of today's webinar, it is available for download on our website at www.ncpers.org/survey. I think William highlighted that earlier in his presentation. And if you go to that page, it will also take you to the dashboard. The dashboard is available for members behind our password protection. And if you need to get access to your plan's password, please contact us and we'll be happy to remind you of your password or help you reset your password. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, William.
It's my pleasure. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.